Can everybody see my slides?
Yes po.
Yes
Alright.
po, Doc.
Okay, so I'll start. So it's 8:03. Okay. Okay, so the neonatal period is actually a highly vulnerable time for newborns as they undergo many physiologic adjustments required for extrauterine life. So most infants transition well. However, there's a certain number of who would need additional support and close monitoring. So this is what we call the sick newborn. So as defined, they are the ones who are not feeling well or lethargic, or who has systemic illness, or who has a poor weight gain. So these are infants who would require additional support such as IV, oxygenation, and etc. So it is very imperative to obtain a good history to determine the nature of the illness, as well as determining or absence of presence or absence of any risk factors, both maternal and fetal, as well as during the entire course of pregnancy and delivery. Likewise, meticulous examination of these sick newborns can provide useful clues to the etiology of the illness, and also provides a basis for the management plan later on. So a variety of conditions that affect the newborn can either start in utero or during birth or in the immediate postnatal period. So these disorders can be due to prematurity or any congenital malformations or any acquired illnesses or injuries sustained during delivery. So it is therefore essential to recognize different disease manifestations in the newborn, and a good clinical knowledge of the pathophysiology and evaluation of these non-specific signs and symptoms is crucial. So this would be the objective of our lecture for today. So that at the end of this 4-hour lecture, you should be able to have a good clinical knowledge of the most common disease manifestations in the newborn period. So this will be our lecture outline. So for this first half, we will tackle up to the cardiovascular system. Now, before we start, so I know all of us are. I think the reason you're here because you love medicine. So I would like to share with this quote with you. So I chose medicine because I can think of no other professional avenue more challenging, rewarding, evolve, evolving, and noble. Okay, the first 28 days of life after birth are described as the newborn period. So proper care of the newborn babies forms the foundation of the subsequent life, not only in terms of longevity or survival, but also in terms of qualitative outcome without any mental and physical disability. This should be our goal actually in managing or taking care of newborn patients. So the first 28 days of life remain the most vulnerable period for a child's survival. So in 2021, approximately 2.3 million children died during the first month of life, or this translates to 6,400 babies every day. So these deaths constituted nearly 47% of the under 5 deaths that took place in that same year. So at the end of this, prematurity and low birth weight topped the list of about one-third of neonatal deaths, followed by perinatal asphyxia, which is about 10%, and is known to cause in the survivors such as long-term sequelae such as impaired attention span, hyperactivity, epilepsy, mental retardation, or any pseudobulbar or bulbar palsies and auditory deficits. And third would be serious neonatal infections, which includes congenital infections such as the torch infection, acquired infections such as sepsis and pneumonias. So clearly a trio of prematurity, low birth weight, and IUGR, plus serious infections and birth asphyxia accounts for as high as 85 to 90% of the neonatal mortality. And summing it up, congenital malformations are responsible for nearly 10% of the deaths. So the risk of mortality and major morbidity is particularly high around the time of birth. So therefore, within the spectrum of infant mortality, certain subcategories are used in maternal and child health practice to focus on specific periods of high risk. So the perinatal period is typically defined as the time from the 28th week of pregnancy through the 7th postpartum day, while the neonatal period spans the first 28 days of life and can be further subdivided into the early neonatal infancy progresses.
Recording stopped.
So during which the perinatal and neonatal periods, preterm births, sepsis and asphyxia predominate, as you see in the previous slide. Moreover, in the developing countries with limited resources, wherein the neonatal mortality rate is high, preterm births,
Recording in progress.
but other causes such as infection or asphyxia and complication of labor and delivery add an additional burden to this. Now, most infants complete the transition to extrauterine life without difficulties, about 90% actually. However, a small portion require resuscitation after birth, just about 10%. For a newborn infant, the need for resuscitation is often caused by a problem with respiration leading to inadequate ventilation. So this is in contrast to an adult cardiac arrest, which is usually caused by inadequate circulation. So important that we know the primary reason for cardiac arrest in a neonatal in the newborn period is actually ventilatory problem or failure to ventilate. So therefore, the goals of neonatal resuscitation are to establish adequate spontaneous respirations, obtain adequate cardiac output, and prevent morbidity and mortality associated with hypoxic ischemic tissue injury. So high-risk situations should be anticipated from pregnancy, history, and labor. Improve perinatal care and perinatal diagnosis of fetal anomalies allow for appropriate maternal transport for high-risk deliveries. Okay, all babies must be assessed for need of resuscitation at birth upon delivery. So infants who are born limp, cyanotic, apneic, or pulseless require immediate resuscitation before assessment of the first minute of life or the first minute Apgar score. So main goal is to establish ventilation within the first minute of life, which is the golden period or the golden minute. Rapid and appropriate resuscitative efforts improve the likelihood of preventing brain damage and achieving a successful outcome. Otherwise, what would happen? You would have this common neurologic conditions. So CNS disorders are important causes of neonatal mortality and morbidity, both short and long term. So the CNS can be damaged as a result of asphyxia, so I've shown you earlier, hemorrhage or trauma, or it could be secondary to hypoglycemia due to persistent seizure or due to direct cytotoxicity caused by any drugs or maternal medications. Cause is often multifactorial and includes perinatal complications such as hypoxic ischemic injury or postnatal hemodynamic instability, and presence of developmental abnormalities that may be either genetic or environmental. So among the predisposing factors for brain injury include acute and chronic maternal illnesses resulting in utero placental dysfunction, intrauterine infections, or intrauterine growth restrictions, or even having premature births. Also, unavoidable emergencies during delivery process may sometimes result in hypoxic ischemic injury. So cranial hemorrhages are birth injuries that range from minor to extremely severe. So they can be due to birth asphyxia or birth trauma, causing use excessive mechanical force to the baby's head, like the use of forceps or vacuum during delivery. So they can be classified into two, extraaxial, intraaxial. And extraaxial can be further classified into this, while intracranial could be classified into this four. So to discuss first, what are the extraaxial hemorrhages? So most common extracranial injury and most benign is actually caput succedaneum. So the presenting part, which is most often the parietal bone, is the usual site. So edema is there is edema of the affected site, which is soft, superficial, and peaty and crosses the midline. So the lesion steadily resolves over the first few days of life, and there should be no intervention needed. While cephal hematoma is usually seen over the parietal bone and has a distinct margin. So in difference niya with caput. So since it is bleeding confined in the subperiosteal area, this is the reason why it doesn't cross the midline. So this can be associated with linear fracture in about 10 to 20% of cases. Hence, a cranial X-ray is warranted. Spontaneous resolution is expected in the first 2 to 3 weeks. and rarely has a significance from a neurological point of view unless complicated by underlying cerebral hemorrhage. However, subgallal hemorrhage is bleeding in the galea aponeurotica, so hence it is sometimes called subaponeurotic hemorrhage. Blood may spread within the entire scalp and may even dissect into the subcutaneous tissues of the neck. That's why you see edema of the head up to the neck area. So this is strongly associated with vacuum delivery. So lesion generally present at the first hour of life and manifest as a firm fluctuant mass, increasing in size postnatally. So these infants have a relatively high incidence of mortality if left untreated due to hypovolemic shock. And other would require volume expansions or inotropic supports, about 35%, and other would require further blood transfusion for anemia. So after the acute phase, if the infant do survive, then the lesion resolves in 2 to 3 weeks. What about intracranial hemorrhage? It can either be due to birth trauma caused by mechanical application of instruments to the baby's head or by asphyxia. So correct, prompt, and accurate diagnosis is important for proper and timely management to prevent complication. Neonatal traumatic head injuries are estimated to affect approximately 3% of pregnancies and represent approximately 2% of neonatal death. So subdural hemorrhage is uncommon in neonates, but more common in term than preterm. Symptoms depend on the severity and the location of the bleed. Surgical evacuation is needed if with severe hemorrhage. Child abuse must be suspected in all infants with subdural effusion after the immediate immediate neonatal period. What about subarachnoid hemorrhage? It is the most frequent type of bleed, but often is asymptomatic, but may cause refractory seizures. For preterm infants, IVH and periventricular hemorrhage are commonly seen and probably due to prematurity or to hypoxemic injury or infection. What about this? So let's go to this case. So you are evaluating. I would like the students to actually participate in the lecture. Okay. There would be some questions in based on the cases. Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the first case. So you are evaluating a 3-day-old preterm who was born through 26 weeks with a weight of 800 grams on an IV, and blood pressure dropped acutely and developed seizures after. PE showed equal breath sounds with no heart murmur, with hypotonia and a bulging anterior fontanelle and some decreased activity. Laboratory evaluation reveals anemia, metabolic acidemia, and hyperglycemia. So on kidney ultrasound, it showed echogenic density with ventricular dilatation in the coronal view. So what is this, student class? Any answer? Yeah, go ahead. You can type your answer in the Fabro. I can see. Yeah, correct. Aldrin? Ansyan ka, Aldrin? Okay, you're correct. That's IVH. So what is IVH? This is the most common CNS complication of a preterm birth. It is usually develops spontaneously and less frequently, and this may be due to trauma or asphyxia and rarely from a hemorrhagic disturbance or cerebrovascular anomaly. Overall incidence is 30% for the very low birth weight. And the risk is inversely related to gestational age and birth weight, with the smallest and the most immature infants being at the highest risk or the most vulnerable. Site of bleeding is in the germinal matrix or the subependymal germinal matrix. The germinal matrix begins to involute of around 34 weeks post-conceptional age, and thus the peculiar vulnerability of this preterm decreases after this, but is not totally eliminated. So you can still see small bleedings after the 34 weeks of life. And by 36 weeks, the germinal matrix should have involuted in most infants. Hence, IVH is actually rarely seen in term infants. Okay, so what happens? Why is the preterm very vulnerable? Okay. Cerebrovascular auto-regulation is the ability to maintain constant cerebral blood flow over a range of systemic perfusion state. So preterms have a very limited ability to auto-regulate cerebral blood flow, hence a passive pressure state exists. This is actually the reason why. Cerebrovascular auto-regulation is most sensitive to changes in arterial carbon dioxide, with hypercarbia and acidosis causing increased blood flow to the brain. And we know, knowing the condition, this preterm phase during during the immediate period is actually RDS, which caused hypercarbia and acidosis. So any pathologic fluctuations in the cerebral flow velocity may cause IVH. Also, the germinal matrix has a rich blood supply because it produces oligodendrocytes, which is a type of glial cells that produce the myelin sheath between 23 and 32 weeks gestation. However, the blood vessels on this germinal matrix have a poor basement membrane support, thus any changes in the cerebral blood flow make this region susceptible to bleeding. Okay, so IVH in preterm infants primarily occurs in the gelatinous subependymal germinal matrix. So this periventricular area is the site of origin for embryonal neurons in the fetal glial cells, which then migrate outwardly to the cortex. So the cortical neuronal and glial cell precursors develop from the germinal matrix and the adjacent ventricular germinal zone during the late second and third, sabi ko nga, 23 to 30 seconds. The ependymal germinal matrix is highly vascularized region with arterial supply from the anterior and the middle cerebral arteries and the anterior choroidal vessels. However, the immature blood vessels in this highly vascularized region of the developing brain combined with the poor tissue vascular support predispose premature infants to hemorrhage. So thus, bleed may be confined to the germinal matrix or it may rupture into either the lateral ventricles and may thereby become a unilateral or a bilateral germinal matrix or intraventricular hemorrhage. So how would it present in the newborn or in the babies? So in the premature patients. So IVH may be actually there are three presentation. It can be asymptomatic if the bleeding is small, or it can present as a gradual clinical deterioration. This is what we call the saltatory progression with altered levels of consciousness or hypotonia with abnormal eye movements, and it can all be catastrophic. This is the sudden, leading to sudden deterioration on the second to third day of life. So yung chance of bleeding is actually highest after the 72 hours, where you expect actually changes in the hemodynamics due to the improvement in the lung mechanics of the patient. So any deterioration in the second or third day of life with neurologic signs such as apnea or seizures or progressive deterioration of the neurologic status, you have to rule out IVH. Presence of full fontanelles with sudden pallor supported by sudden drop in the hematocrit, and which can be accompanied by hemodynamic instability like hypotension or bradycardia with hyperglycemia, acidemia, and hyperkalemia is actually the expected um results. So the majority of cases in preterm occur within the first 3 days of life. So of these, approximately 50% of hemorrhages occur within the first 5 hours, and 70% occur within the first day of life. This is especially for the very small ones. And by the 7 days of life, 95% of IVH will have occurred. So we usually get our ultrasound within this period. So a small percentage of infants have late hemorrhage between days 14 and 30. And this is usually typically associated with infection. And IVH as a primary event is rare after the first month of life. Okay, so how do we diagnose IVH? Cranial ultrasound is actually the procedure of choice for screening and diagnosing IVH. So the severity of hemorrhage, by the location, the degree of bleeding, and ventricular dilatation on cranial imaging. So for grade 1, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is the left one is the normal ultrasound. So in grade 1, the one in where the cursor is bleeding confined within the subependymal area, or less than 10% of the ventricle is actually affected. This is about 35% of cases. For grade 2, there is bleeding within the ventricle without evidence of, as you can see in this one, without evidence of ventricular dilatation. So there would be about 10 to 50% filling of the ventricles. However, for grade no, this is grade 2. Sorry. This is grade 2. For grade 3, okay, this is grade 1, 2, 3. For grade 3, there is ventricular dilatation, as you can see in this coronal and in the sagittal view, with more than 50% dilatation of the ventricle. While in grade 4, you see in this, there is intraventricular as well as parenchymal hemorrhage. So one of the major complications resulting from IVH is the development of post-hemorrhagic ventricular dilatation, especially for grade 3 and grade 4, because of the um obstruction caused by the hemorrhage in the and the CSF loop. So post-hemorrhagic ventricular dilatation develops in 30 to 50% of infants with severe IVH and is initially asymptomatic in most patients. So what do you see? Actually, you just see enlargement of the head every monitoring. So we do monitor the head circumference weekly at least, and you will see actually excessive enlargement. So the usual is 1 cm every week, but if it's more than 1 cm, then you have to think of, especially if there is gaping sutures. So therefore, sequential cranial ultrasonography facilitates early detection. So the term ventriculomegaly is occasionally used for both infants with ventricular enlargement following IVH as well as those without hemorrhage. So in infants without IVH, ventricular enlargement is most likely due to white matter loss rather than an accumulation of CSF. So therefore, it is preferable to use the term What about PVL? So PVL is characterized by focal necrotic lesion in the periventricular white matter. So different IVH sa PVL, okay ha? So PVL did I get disconnected, guys?
Yes po, Doc.
Very brief lang though, no? Okay. Okay. Sige, let me share my slides again. I think starting to rain here in my part of Laguna. Let me disconnect some gadgets muna. Okay. Okay. Where did we stop? PVL. So let's, ano na lang, sorry. Okay. Okay, let's go back to PVL. So as I've mentioned, this is characterized by focal necrotic lesions in the periventricular white matter, which can either be cystic or diffuse. So the risk for PVL increases in infants with severe IVH or with ventriculomegaly. So the corticospinal tracts descend through the periventricular white matter. So that's why the strong association between CP and PVL, or development of CP or cerebral palsy. So predisposing factors include prematurity or any dysregulation in the cerebral blood flow, maternal fetal infections, or any disturbances in the oligodendrocytes precursors that is needed for myelination, or any factors contributing to the development of HIE or a hypoxic ischemic injury, or any IVH may cause actually decrease in the cerebral perfusion, leading in turn to periventricular hemorrhage and necrosis. So the watershed area, which is the area around the periventricular white matter, is the most vulnerable when a hypoxic ischemic condition arises. So diminished blood flow and fluctuations in the blood pressure lead to a state of ischemia in this watershed area, and consequently causing cell death due to inadequate blood flow, and ultimately the ischemia results in white matter injury, wherein there's a decreased volume due to the infarct or in this area. So PVL may be initially as observed during the first week of life in the very low birth weight infants, as increased echogenicity of the periventricular white matter, and sometimes described as blush or flare. So these areas of white matter abnormalities may become cystic or on ultrasonography within the first 3 weeks of life, and lead to ventriculomegaly from white matter volume loss, which can be visible on repeat ultrasound at term equivalent of age. So we do actually serial ultrasound in this newborn, in this premature patients. So PVL is usually clinically asymptomatic until the neurologic sequelae of white matter damage become apparent in the late infancy as spastic with or without motor deficit. So this is what we call cerebral palsy. Now, how do we manage post-hemorrhagic ventricular dilatation? So management is largely symptomatic. So seizure should be treated with anticonvulsants. In anemia and coagulopathy require transfusion with packed or red cells or fresh frozen plasma if indicated. So shock and acidosis are treated with fluid resuscitation. So insertions of a periventricular shunt is actually the preferred method to treat progressive and symptomatic post-hemorrhagic hydrocephalus. So some infants would require temporary CSF diversion before a permanent shunt can be safely inserted because of their actually size. Sometimes there is no size available for these very small ones. Diuretics and acetazolamide are not actually effective, and I've seen this firsthand. Ventricular access devices such as reservoir and externalized ventricular drains are potential temporizing interventions, although there is an associated risk of infection and puncture podocencephaly from injury to the surrounding parenchyma. So a ventricular subgallal shunt inserted from the ventricle into a surgically created subgallal pocket provides a closed system for for a constant ventricular decompression without these additional risk factors. So decompression is regulated by pressure gradient between the ventricle and the subgallal pocket. On one approach to therapeutic intervention is based on the severity of ultrasonographic dimensions of ventricular sizes as seen on this table. So the management will be dependent on the risk category of the patient. Okay, what about prognosis? So in terms of prognosis or outcome, several studies show that the degree of IVH and presence of PVL are strongly linked to survival and neurodevelopmental impairment. So for infants with birth weight of less than 1,000 grams, or the extremely premature patient or extremely low birth weight infants, the incidence of severe neurologic impairment as defined by Bayley scales of infant developmental 4 and mental developmental index of less than 70 or a psychomotor developmental index of less than 70 as well, with presence of cerebral palsy, blindness, or deafness, after an IVH is the highest with grade for is highest at grade for patient with a grade for hemorrhage and low birth weight. PVL, cystic PVL, and progressive hydrocephalus requiring shunt insertions are actually independently associated with a poorer prognosis based on this table. And the risk of poor neurodevelopmental outcome is significantly higher when severe IVH is complicated with post-hemorrhagic ventricular dilatation in about 40 to 60% of cases, and more so for infants with who eventually develop post-hemorrhagic hydrocephalus. So hindi naman lahat na may magbi-bleed magkakaroon ng IVH. This is strongly associated with those severe IVH like in grade 3 and grade 4. So in the pre-surfactant era, up to 80% of infants with post-hemorrhagic hydrocephalus who survived developed significant neurologic impairments, with CP being the most common clinical sequelae. And the drainage irrigation fibrinolytic therapy, or what we call the DRIFT trial, performed a neurocognitive assessments at both 2 years and 10 years after birth. And what did they see? And they showed that there is improved cognitive ability when considering birth weight, grade of IVH, and sex. So infants who received the drift or part of the drift trial were almost twice as likely to survive without severe cognitive disability than those who received the standard treatment. So what about early versus late ventricular intervention study? Trial. They demonstrate effectiveness of intervention at a low threshold of ventricular dilatation on the outcomes of death and severe neurodevelopmental disability in preterm infants with post-hemorrhagic ventricular dilatation. And also, post-hoc analysis demonstrated that these infants who went on to have a shunt had better neurodevelopmental outcome scores if interventions were done at a lower threshold. So the most important protective factors against the development of IVH is actually antenatal administration of corticosteroids. So particularly betamethasone. So a single course of antenatal corticosteroid is recommended for pregnant women between 24 weeks and 36 weeks gestation who are at risk for preterm delivery within 7 days. So antenatal administration as well of magnesium sulfate was not associated with the reduction in the incidence of IVH, although it has been associated with the reduction in the risk of cerebral palsy. So these are two interventions actually that are part of the standard care for preterm delivery. Prophylactic indomethacin showed a significant reduction in the incidence of severe IVH. However, this reduction in severe IVH has not been associated with reduction in cerebral neurosensory impairment later on. Okay, now we go to this second case. So, asan na yung case? Nawala ang case. Okay, a mother was rushed in for stat CS due to abruptia, placenta, APGAR scores are 2, 3, 8, improving after IPPV or intermittent positive pressure ventilation, chest compression, and fluid resuscitation. So baby was admitted to NICU and mother had an eventful antenatal course. Baby later developed generalized tonic-clonic seizures and bradycardia within the first 12 hours of life and given phenobarbital. So what is the most likely cause of the seizure? What do you think, guys? What's the cause of the seizure? Okay, maybe that you'll see the answer after. So, what is seizure? Actually, seizure in the neonates have a very different forms and have a unique feature as compared with those seen in older infants. It may be classified according to the most prominent component. So they can be as simple as subtle seizures or what we call automatisms, or could be focal, multifocal, or tonic-clonic or myoclonic. So what are subtle seizures? It could only be eye deviation or blinking or mouth movements with accompanied apnea or fluctuations in the vital signs. And this is the most common types of neonatal seizures, both for preterm and term infants. While multifocal clonic, when there's jerking, observed in one limb, then migrating to another, and this is not associated with apnea or eye movement. So this is primarily seen in full-term infants, while the focal clonic is when it is only if it only involves one limb or area. So this may represent disease which could be seen in either preterm and term infants. While the tonic seizures are when there is actually change in posture. There's posturing or stiffening or rigidity of the extremities observed, and you usually see this in preterm infants. Lastly, myoclonic, when there is rapid sudden shot like of jerky movements of with reflections of all extremities, and you could see this mostly in term infants. So seizure may be due to a wide variety of causes and can be categorized as post asphyxia, as we actually we see in the case, due to hypoxic ischemic injury, or post hemorrhagic due to IVH in like especially in preterm infants, or due to subarachnoid hemorrhage as caused by birth trauma, or due to a metabolic condition such as hyponatremia, hypocalcemia, hypomagnesemia, and hypoglycemia. Especially in infants born to diabetic mother, or in infants with inborn error of metabolism. It could also be due to metabolic maternal drug ingestions, or a neonatal narcotic withdrawal, like withdrawal from tawag doon, alcohol, or withdrawal from narcotics. Yeah, narcotics, and as well as opioids or any drugs. And it could be also due to bilirubin encephalopathy, or when there's severe jaundice. And lastly, it could be due to infectious process or encephalitis. Okay, treatment involve addressing the underlying cause of the seizure. Okay. So for this patient, we know the seizure is caused by asphyxia brought about by the abruptia placenta. So what is perinatal asphyxia? So this is a pathologic condition referred to a neonate who have no spontaneous breathing or represented regular breathing movement after birth. So usually caused by perinatal hypoxia. It is an emergency condition and will need neonatal resuscitation. So the incidence is between 1 to 1.1 and 1.5%, with 9% in neonates less than 36 weeks gestation, and it accounts for 23% of perinatal death, as you see in the first diba, in my first slide. So the top three causes of death, neonatal death, and one of this is actually perinatal asphyxia. About 33 to 50% of survivors would have permanent brain injury leading to cerebral palsy. So any factors which interferes with the circulation between maternal and the fetal blood exchange could result to perinatal asphyxia. So these factors can be maternal, neonatal, or events during the birth of the newborn. So this definition using the upper score is not applicable actually for preterm infants or babies with birth trauma or congenital neurologic abnormalities. Okay. So the timing of injury is very critical. So insult can either happen during antenatal or intrapartal, or even in the postnatal period. What are the antepartum conditions? Like if there is abnormal maternal oxygenation, like there is presence of severe anemia or cardiopulmonary disease, causing inadequate placental perfusion, as in the presence of severe hypertension and maternal vascular disease. It can cause actually antepartal asphyxia. For intrapartum injury, any interruption of the umbilical circulation, like presence of true knot or cord prolapse, or inadequate placental perfusion, as seen in abruptia placenta or uterine rupture, or any abnormal uterine contractions, as well as abnormal maternal oxygenation during labor and delivery, could cause intrapartum asphyxia. And for postnatal naman, there is persistent pulmonary hypertension, severe circulatory insufficiency due to acute blood loss and presence of shock for this newborn. So of these three, most asphyxial event happens during the intrapartum stage. So the circulatory initial circulatory response of the fetus is actually increased in the shunt through the ductus venosus, ductus arteriosus, and the foramen ovalis. So this is actually your fetal shunts. So with transient maintenance of perfusion of the brain, heart, and agina. So this is actually what we call diving reflex. So there is preferential blood flow to the vital organs, the three organs, brain, heart, and adrenals. And the pathology of ischemia depends on the affected organ and the severity of the injury, as you see in this multi-organ systemic affectation of asphyxia. So among the most targeted organs are the following. So the renal dysfunction is this accompanies for perinatal asphyxia with renal damage ranges from reversible cloudy swelling of the tubules to infarction of the entire nephron. So this leads to a decrease in the urine output, which may last for several days or weeks. Protein and cast may be seen in urine and gross hematuria may be present. So there will be derangement of the renal function, and there will be polyuria following oliguric phase. So what needs to be done is to prevent anuria. So any amount of urine is actually important. What about cardiovascular dysfunction? This may cause MI, which is usually transient, presence of tachycardia, tachypnea, and hepatomegaly, which are consistently with presence of CHF, may be seen, and this would seldom lead to cardiogenic shock or death if severe. Pulmonary dysfunction showed pulmonary edema or which is secondary to myocardial dysfunction and can manifest with respiratory distress. While acute respiratory distress syndrome sets in, which is secondary to increased plasma protein that may lead to inactivation surfactant. So you see a whiteout lung in this patient. While CNS, for me, is the most detrimental condition. This is the most serious complication of perinatal asphyxia. The neurologic sequelae often persist. Hypoxia impairs the cerebral oxidative mechanism and leads to MI that may lead to failure in the cerebral blood flow, which will result to ischemia of the brain tissues. So persistence of hypoxia leads to an increase in anaerobic glycolysis, ending up with lactic acidosis. So if not corrected at this time, it may cause loss of cerebral vascular autoregulation, further compromising brain perfusion. So what happens when there is an asphyxial event? So these are actually the pathophysiology of HIE. So this is very complicated. So please bear with me. So the first phase is what we call the primary energy failure phase, which occurs as a result of the initial reduction of the cerebral blood flow. So the impairment of the cerebral blood flow leads to decrease in oxygen and glucose. So as you see in this one, no? There is decrease sa leftmost. Let's start mo tayo sa leftmost. So there is decrease in oxygen and glucose because of the temporary cessation of blood flow. Then this leads to significantly less energy, ATP, and increased lactate production. So the low ATP levels cause the failure of many of the mechanisms that maintain cell integrity, particularly the sodium ATPase pump, the sodium potassium pump, and mechanism to maintain low intracellular calcium. So when the sodium potassium pumps fail, an excessive influx of positively charged sodium ions precipitate a massive depolarization of the neurons. So this leads to release of glutamate, which is a prominent excitatory neurotransmitter. So the glutamate binds to glutamate receptors, allowing additional influx of intracellular calcium and sodium. Then this increased intracellular calcium has a significant detrimental effects leading to cerebral edema, ischemia, microvascular damage with resultant necrosis and apoptosis. So these two types of cell deaths occur in both primary and secondary energy failure. So we have necrosis and apoptosis. So most of the effects of the primary energy failure leads to cellular necrosis through impaired cellular integrity or disruption of the cytoskeleton and cell membrane. So necrosis occurs in condition of very severe hypoxia and ischemia. So if the insult is less severe, then the cells may recover or progress to apoptosis or the programmed cell death. So apoptosis causes cell shrinkage and general preservation of the cellular membranes with no associated inflammation. So the apoptosis can occur days following the initial injury, but both necrosis and apoptosis can lead to decreased brain function. So once blood flow is restored, there is a brief period of recovery. So we call this the latent period. This is characterized typically by normal cerebral metabolism. So the latent period is thought to vary depending on the extent of the severity of the hypoxic ischemic insult. So with the most severe insult, the shorter the latent period. So the latent period is actually the optimal timing for therapeutic interventions such as therapeutic hypothermia. So the golden period is actually the first 6 hours after the insult. So let's go to the secondary energy failure. What happens in this phase? So this occur after the latent phase actually, the latent period, which is typically from 6 hours to 48 hours after injury. So the exact mechanism of this secondary energy failure remain unclear, but appear to be related to oxidative stress, excitotoxicity, and inflammation. So any overproduction of free radicals, like giving excessive oxygen, which may cause damage to neuronal cell membranes and lead to necrosis or apoptosis, cause oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is particularly harmful to the neonatal brain because of their low concentrations of antioxidants and the high consumption of oxygen when transitioning from fetal to neonatal life. So the decreased ability of the neonatal brain to eliminate free radicals and increase susceptibility to free radicals leads to damage to this neuronal tissue. Excitotoxicity occurs when excessive levels of extracellular neurotransmitters such as particularly glutamate overstimulate the excitatory receptors. So overstimulation allows additional influx of sodium and calcium into the neural cells, and glutamate is used by a variety of neuronal pathways, which includes hearing, vision, somatosensory functions, or as well as learning and memory, which can account for the disruptive effect of HIE on subsequent development of these functions. As you see, they're highly susceptible to sensorineural hearing loss later on and neurocognitive disability later on. So inflammation is also thought to be important in the development of HIE-related brain injury, but the exact mechanism remains unknown. Animal model shows that infiltration of neutrophils into the cerebral tissue during the early stage of injury lead to cerebral edema, so further compromising cerebral edema. So after the acute insult, as blood supply is reestablished to the injured tissue, there is a 30 to 60 period of recovery of cellular energy pathways. So this is what we call the reperfusion phase. So depending on the severity of the insult, the intracellular apoptotic cascades might be triggered, resulting in a latent phase starting between 6 hours from the time of injury and lasting up to 15 hours. So this apoptotic cascade results in neuronal cell death and stimulates inflammatory sequence that can further trigger a secondary phase of cell death. Okay, it's very complicated. So now we go to staging. So how do we stage based on the severity of the encephalopathy? So it depends on the timing and the duration of injury. So depending on the severity and timing of the insult, a neonate with hypoxemic encephalopathy due to perinatal asphyxia can demonstrate a wide variety of neurologic findings, as you can see in this stage, in this Harnett staging. So using the staging in stage 1, the least severe, there is generous sympathetic tone, and the neonate may be hyper alert with prolonged periods of wakefulness, with mydriasis and increased deep tendon reflexes. Yun lang yung pertinent in stage 1. For stage 2, neonate may be lethargic or obtunded with decreased tone, with strong distal flexion, and generalized parasympathetic tone with meiosis, bradycardia, and increased secretion. So seizures are common in stage 2. For stage 3, which is the most severe, it is characterized by a profoundly decreased level of consciousness, flaccid tone, decreased deep tendon reflexes, and very abnormal EEG. So clinical seizures are less common in stage 3 because of the profound injury in the brain, preventing propagation of clinical seizures. So outcome depends on the stage with good outcome for stage 1, variable for stage 2 depending on the extent of the seizure, and but for 3, high likelihood of death, and those who would survive will have 100% deficit. So the topography of cerebral injury typically correlates with the areas of decreased cerebral blood flow in areas of relatively higher metabolic demand, although regional vulnerabilities are impacted by gestational age and severity of the insult. So for term infants, they demonstrate neuronal necrosis of the cortex, particularly lateral cortical atrophy and parasagittal ischemic injury. For preterm infants, they have PVL or status marmoratus of the basal ganglia and IVH. Term more often than preterm have focal or multifocal cortical infarcts that may manifest as focal seizures and hemiplegia. So how do we diagnose HIE? Cranial ultrasound is the preferred modality for preterm infants, but not for term infants. Since the scan is helpful in identifying hemorrhage and cortical injuries, but it is not sensitive during the first few days of life because of the massive cerebral edema and the immediate post-asphyxial event. So diffusion-weighted MRI is actually the preferred diagnostic modality early in the disease and has a greater resolution in delineating brain lesions. So how do we approach management? So treatment is purely actually symptomatic. So therapeutic hypothermia, whether head cooling or systemic cooling by maintaining a core temperature of 33.5 within the first 6 hours after birth up to 72 hours of life, has shown to reduce mortality and major neurodevelopmental impairment at 18 months of age. So infants treated with systemic hypothermia have a lower incidence of cortical neuronal injury on MRI, suggesting systemic hypothermia may result in more uniform cooling of the brain and deeper CNS structures than selective head cooling. Okay. The therapeutic effect of hypothermia likely results from decreased secondary neuronal injury achieved by reducing rates of apoptosis and the production of mediators related to neurotoxicity, particularly excessive influx of sodium and glutamate, and calcium, causing excessive influx of glutamate. So there's also benefit in seizure reduction. However, outcome of HIE correlates with the timing severity of the insult ranging from complete recovery to death. So the prognosis varies depending on the severity of the insult and the timeliness of interventions. So infants with initial cord pH of less than 6.7 have a 90% risk of death or severe neurodevelopmental impairment at 18 months of age. In addition, infants with Apgar scores of 0 to 3 at the first 5 minutes with high base deficits of more than 20, with decerebrate posturing, with severe basal ganglia thalamic lesions, and persistence of HIE at 72 hours postpartum, and lack of spontaneous activity are also at risk for death or impairment. So these predictor variables can be combined to determine a score that helps with prognosis. So infants with the highest risk are likely to die or have severe disability despite aggressive treatment, including hypothermia. So this group of patients have the poorest prognosis. This is actually we use in prognosticating this kind of injury or this kind of condition. Now we go to spinal cord injury. So the mechanism of spinal cord injury involves stretching of the spinal cord secondary to a longitudinal traction on the trunk while the head is still firmly engaged. So you do not pull actually. The OB should not should not put excessive traction on the head as babies getting delivered. So there are four clinical patterns of affected infants. The first group, these are the most severe actually, the stillborns or born with severe respiratory depression or shock and hypothermia. So level is a high cervical or brainstem lesion. For the second group, they appear either normal at birth or with the same signs as the first group, and which would die later after several days. Lesions is in the upper or mid cervical region and undetectable for days with a negative X-ray findings. The third group involves the lesion on the C7 to T1 vertebrae, may be reversible though we may have permanent sequelae with longer periods of survival for this group. While the fourth group, they have the best survival. However, they would have associated spastic with subtle neurologic signs later. Risk factors include breech delivery requiring version and extraction of of the body of the head, I mean, with brow and face presentations also, presence of dystocia, prematurity, or any with those with precipitous delivery. So treatment is mostly supportive. Rehab is very important. What about nerve injuries? So facial nerve palsy may result from birth trauma or due to agenesis of the facial nerve nucleus resulting to Mobius sequence. So birth trauma or agenesis of the facial nerve nucleus is seen and when there is paralysis. So it could either be central and peripheral. Yun na lang para medyo hindi magulo. So for central paralysis, there is localized paralysis to one side, with the affected side seems to be swollen with noted smoothness and fullness of the affected side. So movement of the eyelid and forehead is not affected. And this is typically associated with 6 cranial nerve palsy for central paralysis. For those with peripheral paralysis, it involves the entire side of the face. If it's complete with affectation of the forehead and the eyelids. So 90% of cases undergo complete spontaneous resolution after. Okay, what about brachial plexus injury? So this is caused by mechanical trauma from C5 to T1 spinal nerve roots resulting to paralysis of the muscles of the upper extremity. And typically, there are three types according to lesion. So for the C5 to C6, this is what we call the upper arm paralysis or the herb de Chien, which is the most common, and you can see the waiter's tape as you see in this picture. The second one is the C8 to T1 or the clumsy or lower arm paralysis, which is the most actually rare. And because of the involvement of the T1, there is ipsilateral Horner syndrome present. And the third one is the paralysis of the whole arm. So treatment include initial conservative management with closer follow-up and vigilant decision-making for surgical intervention. 93 to 95% attain function of the affected extremity with conservative management. And this will be our last for the nerve injury, the phrenic nerve paralysis or C3 to C5 nerve involvement. This is rare actually to occur alone, and usually it results in diaphragmatic paralysis. So it is unilateral and usually accompanied by ipsilateral brachial plexus paralysis. So most often it is associated with a brachial plexus paralysis. Ineffectual breathing on the affected side with no elevation of the abdomen upon inspiration and presence of recurrent cyanosis. On physical examination, you see dullness or with diminished breath sound in the affected area because of the elevation of the diaphragm. And on X-ray, you would see actually elevation of the affected diaphragm with shifting of the heart and the mediastinum to the opposite side, and areas of atelectasis on the affected side. So supportive medical management is the treatment of choice with a window period of 1 month. So if there is no improvement, then it's the time they entertain surgical intervention. Okay, now we go to respiratory diseases. Sige, you may stretch, drink your coffee para naman magising-gising tayo. What time is it? What's the time? Okay, 1 hour. At least, actually, the neuro part is actually the most comprehensive and hard to lecture. After this, it's easier na for you. Okay, now we go to respiratory diseases. So the successful transition from placental-derived oxygen delivery to pulmonary respiration requires timely completion of the fetal lung fluid clearance, creation of functional residual capacity, increase in the pulmonary blood flow, and establishment of normal breathing patterns. So failure in any of these tasks are associated with respiratory disorders in the newborn. So respiratory disorders are the most frequent cause of admission for NICU, both in-term and preterm infants. And early recognition, timely referral, and appropriate treatment are essential in the survival of this newborn. So these are the signs and symptoms commonly seen in this newly born patients with the following diagnostics test procedures commonly entertained or commonly requested to to see what is the main cause of the respiratory distress. So based on this figure, there is a wide variety of pathologic lesions that may cause respiratory distress, not just pulmonary but including non-pulmonary causes. So in some instances, it is difficult to distinguish respiratory from non-respiratory etiologies based on clinical symptoms alone. Hence, diagnostic tests such as X-ray, chest radiograph is very important to aid in the diagnosis. So because outcome is dependent on the timeliness of our intervention. So to give some general causes of respiratory distress, both for pulmonary and extrapulmonary causes. So these are the most common pulmonary causes. So we will discuss some of this. And extrapulmonary causes. So we will not discuss this actually, except for cardiac. Okay, how do we approach a newborn with respiratory distress? First, important is a good history. Then when onset of the distress, important to know the gestational age, if this is preterm where the neonatal steroids given, or any predisposing factors such as presence of premature rupture of membranes, maternal fever, as well as presence of meconium, staining, and asphyxia. Then followed by a good physical examination, determining the severity index of the respiratory distress, our neurological status, vital signs, and any signs of sepsis and presence of malformations. So the presence of any of the following of the four clinical features such as tachypnea of more than 60, counted fulminate though, significant lower chest retractions, presence of grunting, and central cyanosis actually correspond to respiratory distress. So on physical examination, observe the vital signs, CRT, as well as saturations. You have to take note if umbilical cord has meconium staining, determine if there is hyperinflation of the chest. What we see is barrel chested, and as well as presence of bowel sounds on that chest. Kasi what if this is congenital diaphragmatic hernia? So if there is cyanosis, was tachycardia present or a murmur present? So look for abdomen, examine the abdomen, check if it's scaphoids or you think of CDH, as well as evidence of intracranial hemorrhage or failure to pass OGT when putting an OGT. On X-ray, what do you see? There is air entry, mediastinal shift, adventitious sound. On chest examination, you check for air entry, if there is presence of mediastinal shift or presence of adventitious sounds, if there is hyperinflation as yun nga, air trapping, as seen when there is barrel chested, and presence of heart murmurs. So in each and every infant with respiratory distress, it becomes mandatory to assess the gravity of the condition and determine the factors underlying the problem. So only then you can initiate the right type of management. So there are two types of scoring that we use, the Down and the Silverman scoring. Down scoring system is used for assessing severity of respiratory distress for term infants, while the Silverman scoring is for preterm infants. Both consist of 5 items. So you see in this 5 items for the Down scoring, the level of the respiratory rate, presence of cyanosis, central cyanosis, presence of retractions, granting, and the air entry. And then you assign the score para lang tong upward scoring but baliktad. For 0 to 4, score of 0 to 4, uh, less than 40% of oxygen is needed. So meaning, hindi ganun mad lang yung distress niya. But for 5 to 7, you have to entertain putting the patient on CPAP. For more than 8, have to think of assisted ventilation due to impending respiratory arrest. So this is also true in the Silverman scoring. So here the scoring system consists of chest movement, intercostal retractions, xiphoid retractions, nasal flaring, and expiratory grant. Same sila na scoring. For 5 to 7, CPAP is entertained. For more than 8, intubation is actually necessary due to impending arrest. Okay, now we go to this case. A 1.5 kilo male delivered vaginally preterm at 33 weeks, upper score 7 and 8 at 1 and 5 minutes. And infant is cyanotic and requires CPAP eventually. So based on the Silverman scoring. He has subcostal retractions with granting and alar flaring. Diyan pa lang 6 na siya. So auscultation reveals decreased air entry in the lung field all throughout, with temperature of 36.8, heart rate of 175 and 77. So what is the likely diagnosis, guys? Okay, correct. Respiratory distress syndrome. Thank you, Philip. So what is RDS? So incidence of this condition is primarily in the premature infants. Preterm, less than 37 weeks. So any preterm can have RDS. It is inversely proportional to gestational age and birth weight, however. So the risk factors include prematurity, maternal diabetes, male sex, second-born twin, CS delivery, and perinatal asphyxia. So how does it develop? So a deficiency in surfactant results in atelectasis, decrease in functional residual capacity, with arterial hypoxemia and respiratory distress. So surfactant-induced atelectasis causes alveoli to be perfused but not ventilated. So there goes your VQ mismatch, which results in pulmonary shunt and hypoxemia. So as atelectasis increases, the lungs become increasingly difficult to expand, and therefore lung compliance decreases. Because the chest wall of the premature infant is very compliant, the infant attempts to overcome decreased lung compliance with increasing inspiratory pressure, resulting in retractions of the chest wall. So you have a very compliant lung, chest wall with a poorly compliant lung. Kaya therefore your severe retractions. So the sequence of decreased lung compliance and chest wall retractions leads to poor air exchange with increased physiologic dead space, alveolar hypoventilation, and hypercapnia. So a cycle of hypoxia, hypercapnia, and acidosis acts on type 2 cells to reduce surfactant synthesis, and in some infants, on pulmonary arterioles to produce pulmonary hypertension. So this is actually a vicious cycle. So important that we know this pathophysiology for us to intervene accurately. So RDS may develop immediately in the delivery room in extremely immature infants at around 26 to 30 weeks. So some more mature infants, those with those who are less than more than 34 weeks, may not show signs of RDS until on the 3 to 4 hours after birth, correlating with the initial release of stored surfactant at the onset of breeding, accompanied by the ongoing inability to replace the surfactant owing to inadequate stores. So knowing this actually is very important in managing these preterm patients. Kasi nga, it's not the first breath that is actually problematic. It's the subsequent breaths because of the subsequent increase in the intrapulmonary pressure to open up the lungs. This very poorly compliant lungs. So manifestations of RDS include cyanosis, tachypnea, nasal flaring with intercostal retractions and sternal retractions if severe, and presence of grunting. So grunting is caused by closure of the glottis during expiration, and the effect of which is to maintain lung volume, decreasing atelectasis and improving gas exchange during exhalation. So atelectasis is well documented by getting an X-ray, as you see in this X-ray, which shows a ground glass haze in the lung surrounding air-filled bronchi. So you see the air bronchogram. Ayun, ito yung air bronchogram with a ground glass appearance. So severe RDS may show an airless lung fluid, airless lung field or white out lung, as you see in this X-ray, even obliterating the distinction between atelectatic lungs and the heart, actually. So the severity of the radiographic evidence is based on the a degree of whiteness, actually, or pacification. So if this is like this is severe. Kasi you cannot delineate na the heart margins. Okay, the risk for development of RDS increases with maternal DM, as I've actually identified earlier, with multiple births, second twin, more common to have RDS, CS delivery, precipitous delivery, asphyxia, as well as cold stress and maternal history of previously affected infants. So pag may maternal history of delivering prematurely, then the increased likelihood of her delivering another preterm is actually higher. And the risk of RDS is reduced in presence of chronic or pregnancy-induced hypertension. If chronic, it means chronic, ibig sabihin, early onset of hypertension or preeclampsia. Presence of maternal heroin use, prolonged rupture of membranes of at least more than 12 hours, and antenatal corticosteroid prophylaxis. Okay, now how do we prevent this? So strategies to prevent preterm birth include maternal cervical cerclage if needed, or bed rest, or treatment of infections, and administration of tocolytic management or medication. So in addition, prevention of neonatal cold stress after birth na to. Birth asphyxia or hypovolemia reduce the risk of RDS. So if preterm delivery is unavoidable, then antenatal administration of corticosteroids such as betamethasone or dexamethasone with these doses to the mother stimulate fetal lung production of surfactant, and this approach require multiple dosing for at least 48 hours. So best is delivery after 48 hours upon initiation of the steroid, corticosteroid. So after birth, RDS may be prevented or its severity reduced by intratracheal administration of exogenous surfactant immediately after birth in the delivery room or within a few hours of birth. So a mammalian-derived surfactant is currently preferred. So exogenous surfactant can be administered repeatedly depending on the improvement of the X-ray or the requirement of the patient, the auto requirement of the patient. So basic supportive care is part of the management as well. Specific measures include prevention of hypoxia, acidosis, by providing warm humidified O2 or CPAP at the delivery room or assisted non-invasive ventilation. Okay, what is chronic lung disease? This is actually clinical pulmonary syndrome that develops in the majority of extremely preterm infants and defined by a prolonged need for respiratory support and supplemental oxygenation. This is actually the sequelae of an RDS. So almost 60% of infants born to less than 28 weeks gestation will develop BPD, or the what we call the bronchopulmonary dysplasia, and the incidence increases inversely with gestational age. So the for infants born at 22 to 24 weeks, essentially 100% will develop BPD, and majority of whom will have moderate to severe disease. So as neonatal care improved and use of antenatal corticosteroid has become the standard of care, survival of infants born at the extreme viability improved as well. However, BPD is encountered with increasing prevalence. So the pathogenesis of BPD is likely multifactorial, as you see in this slide, but pulmonary inflammation and lung injury in an immature lung are consistently observed. Alveolar collapse, this is what we call atelectasis trauma, as a consequence of surfactant deficiency, together with ventilator-induced phasic overdistension of the lung, which is what we call volutrauma, promotes lung inflammation and injury. Supplemental O2 produces free radicals that cannot be metabolized by the immature antioxidant system of the very low birth weight infants, and further contributes to the injury, as well as pulmonary inflammation, as evidenced by infiltration of neutrophils and macrophages in the alveolar fluid, as well as host of inflammatory cytokines, contribute to the progression of the lung injury. Prenatal and postnatal infections, excessive pulmonary blood flow via the patent ductus arteriosus, as well as excessive administration of IV fluids, and prenatal and postnatal growth failure are also significantly associated with the development of BPD. As you see, it's a multifactorial um, injury. Lastly, pulmonary arterial hypertension may complicate BPD, although the mechanism is unclear, all likely due to lung injury promote lung injury by necessitating increased or the prolonged respiratory support or interfering with lung repair. All contributed to the development of BPD later on. So how do we diagnose BPD? So when a preterm infant requires supplemental O2 for the first 28 days of life, it is further classified at 36 weeks post-menstrual age according to the degree of O2 supplementation as seen in this diagnostic criteria. So you have no those neonates receiving positive pressure support or more than 20% of O2 at 36 weeks post-menstrual age or at discharge, whichever comes first, are diagnosed as having severe BPD, while those requiring less than 30% supplemental O2 would have moderate BPD. Those who previously required O2 supplementation for at least 28 days but are currently breathing room air upon discharge have mild BPD. So infants who would require O2 for more less than 28 days of life would have no BPD. So actually, it's a number of days of O2 requirement. So infants receiving supplemental O2 should undergo a stepwise reduction in the supplemental O2 to room air at 36 weeks while under continuous observation and with O2 sats monitoring to determine whether they can be weaned off from O2 or not. And this test is highly reliable and correlated with the discharge home the necessity to have a discharge oxygenation at home or length based on the length of hospital stay and as well as hospital readmission in the first year of life. So the risk of neurodevelopmental impairment and pulmonary morbidity and severity of BPD are directly correlated. So treatment of evolving establishing BPD is actually treatment of evolving BPD, those yung expected mo mag-BPD later on, and those with established BPD is actually supportive. So basic tenets of therapy should include appropriate support of ventilation and aggressive nutritional support kasi mas ano yung energy expenditure nila higher. That's why you have to be aggressive with their nutrition and to optimize linear growth and encourage normal lung repair and development. Okay, manifestations of BPD are depending on the O2 dependence, hypercapnia with compensatory metabolic alkalosis. This is what you see in their blood gas. With pulmonary hypertension if chronic and severe. With poor growth, linear growth, and development of right-sided heart failure if actually severe. For those with long-standing pulmonary hypertension. So there is increased airway resistance with reactive airway bronchoconstriction. And you can also treat this with bronchodilating agents. Severe retractions produce negative interstitial pressure that draws fluid into the interstitial space. So together with cor pulmonale, this chest retraction causes fluid retention, necessitating fluid restriction and administration of diuretics. Radiographic appearance of BPD is characterized by initially by lung opacification, as you see in this the leftmost X-ray, with subsequent development of cystic lesions, as you see here, accompanied by with areas of overdistension. Overdistension meaning there is hyperinflation of the hemithorax with flattening of the diaphragm. Then you can see the bubble lungs, as you see in the third one. And the last one is actually it's a picture of a patient with a large right ventricle and a quadruply irregular irritated lung of an infant who died at 11 months old because of cor pulmonale or right-sided heart failure. Okay, I think this is one of our, we're almost done actually. So for this case, a 3.2 delivered CS 38 weeks without a trial of labor. Our scores 9 and 9 during the first and fifth minute, and develops tachypnea and subcoastal retractions with nasal flaring at the first hour of life. Aside from increased work of breathing, physical examination shows normal. And X-ray show this. Okay, so this is what we call transient tachypnea of the newborn. It is self-limited, characterized by tachypnea with very mild retractions and hypoxia and occasional grunting, and usually without signs of severe respiratory distress. O2 requirements is just less than 30%. TTN usually is noted in large premature infants or interim infants born via precipitous delivery or CS without prior labor. So infants of diabetic mother and infants with poor respiratory drive as a result of placental passage of analgesic drive is actually at risk. So in X-ray, you see this one. There is retained lung fluid. Kitang-kita nyo parang ang dumi niya with slow resorption of the lung fluid. So X-ray showed prominent central vascular markings with presence of lung fluid, evidence in the fluid in the lateral fissure as evidenced by this prominent lateral fissure, and with occasional presence of pleural effusion. So you do not see the air bronchograms or in the reticulogranular patterns you see in RDS patient. And okay. For this one naman, this is a 2.9 male born vaginally to a mother with PROM of 22 hours. Apgar scores as 8 and 8 and requiring O2 at more than 40%. Noted to be tachypnic and axocyanotic. So you see chorus rals bilaterally with a temperature of 37, a heart rate of 1 to 44, with a respiratory rate of 65. So despite being given CPAP, there is grunting and tachypnea, worsening of respiratory distress requiring intubation and ventilation for progressive increased work of breathing and respiratory acidosis. So there's progressive pneumonia. This is typically progressive respiratory distress. This is typically seen in patients with neonatal pneumonia or congenital pneumonia. So neonatal pneumonia is acquired transplacentarily or perinatally. It is a manifestation of sepsis in the newborns, which accounts for more than 50% of respiratory distress. Risk factors include PROM of Actually, for our for ours tawag dito. For us, PROM of more than 18 hours for term patients and 12 hours for preterm patients, yun yung significant for us. So presence of prolonged labor of more than 24 hours, especially in the background of rupture of membranes, early rupture of membranes, unclean vaginal examination, presence of foul-smelling amniotic fluid, as well as maternal fever, predispose this patient to pneumonia. Okay, common physiologic agent includes E. coli, Staph aureus, or Klebsiella. And for the West group, GBS is actually the most common, as well as viruses or fungi or aspiration can also cause pneumonia. Manifestations include respiratory distress on top of other features of sepsis, such as decreased feeding or decreased activity or hypothermia. How do you diagnose this? Through radiographic evidence, presence of elevated WBC count or low WBC count, and a positive culture. Treatment-wise, we give antimicrobials to cover for both gram-positive and gram-negative pathogens, as well as placing them on supported treatment.
Recording stopped.
DO and
Recording in progress.
okay. Prognosis-wise, usually good, especially if timely intervention is instituted. Okay, let's now go to this case. 4.4 kilos, so large baby, delivered CS at 41 weeks, so almost ano na siya, post-term na siya because of presumed large of gestational age status. So the amniotic fluid stained with thick meconium. So as you see, this patient is actually thickly stained na kasi yellow na yung color niya. Look at the skin of the baby and as well as the maturity of the skin. So you see this in a 40, usually more than 40 weeks gestation. Apgar scores 2 and 7 with temperature of 37.2, heart rate of 177, and respiratory rate of 80. Physical exam showed marked increase in work of breathing with nasal flaring, subcostal and suprasternal retractions. Ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo, barrel-shaped chest, elevation of the AP diameter, as well as presence of coarse trunci bilaterally. So what is this? This is what we call meconium aspiration syndrome. So this is typically seen in patients with meconium-stained amniotic fluid. Incidence is 10 to 15% at birth, with 5% will develop meconium aspiration pneumonia, as well as 30% will require additional mechanical ventilation, and of this, 3 to 5% may expire or will die due to complication of MAS, which is PPHN or persistent pulmonary hypertension of the newborn. So the clinical features of meconium aspiration syndrome includes RDS soon after birth or respiratory distress syndrome soon after birth in a newborn, newly born patient born to a mother with meconium stained amniotic fluid. So there is hyperinflation of the chest with meconium staining of the skin and the cord, and urine may appear dark and brown. Meconium aspiration pneumonia is characterized by tachypnea, hypoxia, hypercapnia, and small airway obstruction, which may cause a ball valve effect leading to air trapping. Dito na tayo sa air trapping. Okay, and producing atelectasis. So within 24 to 48 hours, a chemical pneumonitis may develop in addition to the mechanical effects of airway obstruction. So there are two types of obstruction, either complete or partial. Yung partial is the one causing the ball valve effect, while for complete, there is a massive atelectasis. Then there would be chemical pneumonitis, and abnormal pulmonary function may be caused by meconium in part through the inactivation of surfactant. So primary pulmonary hypertension of the newborn or PPHN frequently accompanies meconium aspiration with right to left shunting caused by increased pulmonary vascular resistance. So chest radiograph reveals patchy infiltrates, as you see in this X-ray, with overdistension, as you see the presence of air trapping and flattening of the diaphragm. With there could be presence of pneumomediastinum and pneumothoraces. So comorbid disease include those with associated uteroplacental asphyxia that cause the passage of early passage of meconium. Always, when there is passage of meconium, you think of birth hypoxia or as hypoxia in utero. So treatment of meconium aspiration include general supportive care and assisted ventilation. Infant with PPHN-like presentation should be treated with for PPHN. We will discuss this later. Actually, it's the next lecture. It's the next the next slide. So if severe hypoxia does not subside with conventional high frequency ventilation, then surfactant therapy or inhaled nitrogen oxide treatment, ECMO or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation may be beneficial, but it is not actually available in our country. Now, what is PPHN? So same actually condition as previous. So there is saturation. So this is a 4.5 kilos with differential cyanosis, saturation of the right 70%, 45 on the left leg. So we call this differential cyanosis. If there is more than 4% difference in the O2 stats of the preductal and the postductal, and there is actually precordial lift or loud S2. So this is a patient with persistent pulmonary hypertension of the newborn. So what is it? When there's persistence of fetal circulatory pattern of right to left shunting through the PDA and the foramen ovale after birth is actually a result of excessively high pulmonary vascular resistance. The fetal PVR is usually elevated relative to fetal systemic or postnatal pulmonary pressure. So this is true because, di ba, the lung, they don't use the lung in utero. That's why, and it's fluid filled. That's why mataas yung PVR niya or the pulmonary vascular resistance. So this fetal state normally permits shunting of oxygenated umbilical venous blood to the left atrium and consequently to the brain through the foramen ovale, from which it bypasses the lungs through the ductus arteriosus and passes to the descending aorta. This is actually what happens in utero. So what happens after birth? So the PVR normally declines rapidly as a consequence of vasodilation secondary to lung inflation, a rise in the postnatal PaO2, a reduction in the PaO's pulmonary arterial carbon dioxide, with an increase in the pH and release of vasoactive substances such as nitric oxide. So increased neonatal PVR may be due to actually 2 to 4. It could be maladaptive from an acute injury. So there is normal vasodilation. There is an abnormal vasodilation, abnormal vasoconstriction in response to actually to a normal. There is a maladaptive meaning there is no normal vasodilation in response to increased oxygen or other changes after birth. Kasi 'di ba ang response after birth, so there is increasing oxygen tension. So there should be a normal consequently vasodilation. However, for maladaptive, there is an abnormal vasoconstriction. Second would be the result of increased pulmonary arterial medial thickness and extension of the smooth muscle layer into the usually non-muscular this is what we call actually the maldeveloped. Third would be where there is presence of pulmonary hypoplasia, as you seen in patient with diaphragmatic hernia or presence of Potter sequence. So this is also could be maldeveloped but caused by an extrinsic force or underdeveloped due to an extrinsic factor. And fourth would be obstructive. This is actually normally developed. However, due to polycythemia or to total anomalous pulmonary vascular return or alveolar pulmonary capillary dysplasia, then there is obstructive cause causing increased muscularization of the pulmonary arterioles, thereby increasing the pulmonary vascular resistance. So regardless of the etiology, what you see is profound hypoxemia from right to left shunting and normal or elevated pulmonary arterial carbon dioxide is actually present. So clinically, you see this mostly in term or post-term infants, typically presenting with severe cyanosis, with progressive respiratory distress within the first 24 hours of life, with labile oxygenation and severe hypoxemia. And you see a narrowly split S2 with a loud S2. The P2 component, di ba, in S2 you have aortic and the P2 component. The P2 component is actually loud. So if the ductus arteriosus is present, there is no atrial or ventricular shunting, then the preductal otosats is actually more than the postductal otosats. This is what we call differential cyanosis. So of note, if atrial or ventricular mixing occurs, then the preductal and the postductal saturation will be equal. So if there is equal pressure between the two, then you see no differential cyanosis. So how do we manage a patient with PPHN? It's actually pretty supportive. First, obtain an echo to rule out a clinical cyanotic heart disease. Typical echo findings showed pulmonary pressure greater than the systemic pressure with tricuspid regurgitation or bowing of the ventricular septum into the left ventricle with presence of right to left shunting across the PDA or a stretched PFO. You can give antibiotics if there is presence of pneumonia or if especially for those with meconium aspiration syndrome. You may treat underlying lung disease. If this is due to a CDH, then you have to address the CDH or repair the CDH. Supportive in management by sedating the baby, maximizing O2 oxygen carrying capacity of the red cells by sustaining or maintaining an adequate hemoglobin level, maintaining a good cardiac output with a systolic BP of slightly higher than the pulmonary arterial pressure. This is to decrease the left to right, increase the left to right shunting, decreasing the right to left shunting. So ventilatory support, considering placing the patient on HFV or high frequency ventilation, giving nitric oxide if available, as well as sildenafil or bosentan if available. These are actually pulmonary vasodilators. And if all this failed, then we can entertain ECMO. So survival in patients with PPHN varies greatly in the underlying diagnosis and generally have a good survival if treatment, if patient would actually respond to treatment. But those who survive will have who are at risk of neurodevelopmental impairment and sensorineural hearing loss later on. You see in 25% of cases. Outcome in patient with ECMO is about 80% survival, and those who survive appear normal in 1 to 3 years of age. Okay, now we go to pneumothoraces. So this is actually seen in patients with assisted ventilation due to high peak inspiratory pressure and positive end expiratory pressure, causing overdistension of the alveoli, causing rupture of the alveolar epithelial lining. So alveolar rupture adjacent to the pleural space produced pneumothorax. So as you see in this picture. So what you see is actually the sudden distress with the indistinct heart sound, or there is shifting of the heart sound to the other side. So, di ba, dapat important that we auscultate the baby and see where the apex beat is. So, if there is displacement of the apex beat or the PMI, then you have to think of a pneumothorax. So, how do we address this? We do needle aspiration or placing chest tube insertion if needed. Okay, what is CDH? Sorry. So it is defined as a communication between abdominal and the thorax, thoracic cavities, with or without abdominal contents in the thorax. So etiology is rarely traumatic and usually congenital. So the symptoms and prognosis depend on the location of the defect and the associated anomalies. So there are four types. If defect is in the esophageal hiatus, we call this the hiatal hernia. Paraesophageal if adjacent to the hiatus, and retrosternal if it is in the foramen of Morgagni, and Bactalic hernia if it is in the posterior lateral of the diaphragm. So which is the most common, guys? What do you think? Among the four types.
Bukdalek
Actually,
po.
the Bokdalek. Bokdalek hernia is most common, 90% of all hernias. And 80 to 90% will appear on the left side. Bokdalek left, Margagni right. So it's just 2 to 6% of cases. So size of the defect is highly variable, ranging from small to a complete agenesis of this area of the diaphragm. So these lesions may cause significant respiratory distress at birth, can be associated with other congenital anomalies. That's why we actually do screen for other anomalies, especially if you see abnormal facial features. And it is significantly associated with high mortality or long-term morbidity. So although CDH is characterized by structural diaphragmatic defect, a major limiting factor for the survival is actually association with other anomalies or syndromes, and primarily with pulmonary hypoplasia. Ito yung isang type of pulmonary hypertension due to pulmonary hypoplasia because of the underdevelopment of the affected lung because of the presence of the CDH. So pulmonary hypoplasia is characterized by a reduction in pulmonary mass and the number of bronchial divisions, respiratory bronchioles, and alveoli. So sabi nila, based on studies, the onset actually of CDH is very crucial in the development of lung. So if it's occur less than 20 weeks, then you know that this lung actually did not develop. So this is a poorly developed lung, and then hence strongly associated with high mortality. So the pathology of pulmonary hypoplasia and CDH includes abnormal septa in the terminal sacules with the thickened alveoli and thickened pulmonary arterioles. Biochemical abnormalities include relative surfactant deficiencies with increased glycogen in the alveoli and decreased level of phosphatidylcholine, total DNA, and total lung protein, all of which contribute to the limited gas exchange. So this would lead to respiratory failure, as you see in this flow diagram. Now, how do we address this type of condition? So delivery in a tertiary hospital is with experience in managing such condition is required to provide early appropriate respiratory support. So in the delivery room, infants with RDS should be properly stabilized with endotracheal intubation, especially if in the presence of a scaphoid abdomen. So you do not actually stimulate this baby, you do outright intubation. Kasi prolonged mass ventilation enlarges the stomach, causing overdistension of the small bowels, causing failure, more difficult to oxygenate, and further aggravating the distension in of the of the intestines occupying the lung, affected lung, causing or hindi lalo magdidistan yung lung. That's why we have to do outright intubation. So once in the NICU, central, we actually place arterial and venous umbilical lines to monitor the oxygen saturations of this patient. A preductal O2 saturation of more than 85% is actually the minimum goal. An initial arterial carbon dioxide of more than 80 is predictive actually of high mortality kasi meaning underdeveloped talaga yung lungs na yon. So conventional mechanical ventilation or high frequency ventilation and ECMO are actually the three main strategies to support respiratory failure in newborns with CDH. The goal is to maintain adequate oxygenation and elimination of carbon dioxide without inducing volutrauma. Conventional ventilation using a gentle lung protective strategy like PIP of at least 25, a positive index pressure of 3 to 5, allowing a permissive hypercapnia of at least up to 65.
Recording stopped.
And then,
Recording in progress.
while permissive hypercapnia has reduced lung injury and improved survival. So when you say permissive hypercapnia, allowing a PaCaO2 level of at least of up to 65 is actually acceptable. So those patients who placed on HFOV, high frequency oscillatory ventilation, is actually is warranted if the patient is in mechanical ventilator and would require more than 25 PI pressure of PI inspiratory pressure of 25. So it is better if this patient will be placed on high frequency ventilation. Okay. What about inhaled nitric oxide? It is a selective pulmonary vasodilator. It reduces ductal shunting, pulmonary pressure, and results in improved oxygenation. Although inhaled nitric oxide has been helpful in PPHN, randomized trials have not demonstrated improved survival or reduced need for ECMO when inhaled nitric oxide is used in newborns with CDH. Nonetheless, inhaled nitric oxide is used in patients with CDH as a bridge to ECMO. So, para before you put the patient on ECMO, you can do inhaled nitric oxide first. So most experts plan surgery at least 48 hours after stabilization and resolution of the pulmonary hypertension. Good relative indicators of stability are the requirement for conventional ventilation only, or a low PIP less than 25, or an FiO2 of less than 50%. If the newborn is receiving ECMO, an ability to be weaned from this support should be a consideration before surgical repair. Following surgical repair, infant must be carefully monitored for worsening pulmonary hypertension. So in some patients, a postoperative course of ECMO is needed. Other recognized complications include bleeding or presence of chylothorax and bowel obstruction. Recurrence rate is about 10% of cases, typically during the first year of life, but it can also occur in the first 5 years of life. Overall survival of live-born infants with CDH is about 75% in the first world countries. So relative predictors of poor prognosis include associated major anomaly or syndrome, presence of severe pulmonary hypoplasia, herniations of the to the contralateral lung. Ibig sabihin, ganun ka-severe yung herniation, and the need for ECMO. So the size of the defect appear to be the strongest predictor of morbidity. What about presence of GER? So it's reported in more than 50% of cases, those born with CDH. It is most common in patients with esophageal hiatus hernia. What about intestinal obstructions? So it is reported in 20% of children and result from a midgut volvulus or a presence of adhesions or a recurrent hernia that became incarcerated. So children with CDH typically have delayed growth in the first 2 years of life. Contributing factors include the poor intake, presence of GER, a caloric requirement that may be higher because of the energy required to breathe kasi nga, diba, they're constant in distress. So many children normalize and catch up in growth by the second year of life. Neurocognitive defects, on the other hand, are very common and may result from disease or the interventions itself. So this incidence of neurologic abnormalities is higher in infants who require ECMO, and serious hearing loss may occur in 28% of patients who underwent ECMO actually. So majority of neurologic abnormalities are classified as mild to moderate. Okay, now what about apnea? Apnea is defined as cessation of pulmonary airflow for a specific time interval, usually longer than 20 seconds. If less than 20 seconds, if associated with bradycardia or cyanosis, then it is also apnea. So there are three types: central, obstructive, or mixed. Central, if there is complete cessation of airflow and respiratory efforts with no chest wall movement. Obstructive, usually if there is presence of you see airflow, you see actually uh chest movement, but there is actually depending on the position of the head of the baby. While mixed apnea is a combination of these two, this is the most frequent type. So careful evaluation to determine the cause of apnea should be performed immediately in any infant with apnea. So apnea of prematurity is actually a wastebasket diagnosis. We have to rule out this actually causes of apnea before we say that this patient is suffering from apnea of prematurity. Okay? So how do we treat? We give methylxanthines or caffeine or theophylline. Okay, so this is the last part of our lecture. So we have 5 minutes left. Okay, so why is ito na lang. Sorry. So why is why is CHD or congenital heart disease not apparent in utero? So this is because of the three causes. There's fetal oxygenation is not dependent on pulmonary blood flow. Number one, it's the baby gets oxygen from the placenta. Both the RV and the LV are important for systemic blood flow, diba? You see that there is actually parallel circulation going on, and communications between the left and the right sides of the heart because of the mixing at the atrial and the ductal level. So central cyanosis is defined by absolute amount of reduced hemoglobin observed clinically by 3 to 5 grams reduction of hemoglobin per deciliter of capillary blood. So we have to differentiate central from peripheral cyanosis, as well as differential from reverse differential. Di ba kanina I said differential sinus when the preductal is higher than the postductal? Pag reverse differential naman, postductal is higher than the preductal. You see this in patient with DTGA. So this is just actually an overview of CHDs kasi you'll discuss this more in our cardiovascular portion of the lecture. So VSD is the most common type of CHD, while TOF is most common cyanotic heart disease beyond the neonatal period. During the first week, it's TDGA is the most common, while the second most common is actually the hypoplastic left heart syndrome. However, this is the one with the highest cardiac mortality during this period. Okay. So, a severely ill neonate with respiratory distress and cyanosis is a diagnostic challenge. So, the clinician must perform a rapid evaluation to determine whether congenital heart disease is a cause so that the potentially life saving measures can be instituted. So, congenital heart disease produces cyanosis when obstruction to right ventricular inflow or outflow causes intracardiac right to left shunting, or when there is complex anatomic defects which cause a mixture of pulmonary and systemic venous return in the heart. So cyanosis from pulmonary edema may also develop in patients with heart failure caused by left to right shunts, although the degree is usually less severe compared to with CCHDs. So cyanosis may be caused by persistent of fetal pathways such as right to left shunts across the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus. And you see this in patient with pulmonary outflow tract obstruction such as in patient with PPHN. So is critical cyanotic heart disease? It is defined as lesions requiring surgery or catheter-based intervention in the first year of life, which accounts to 25% of patients with CHD or congenital heart disease. So many newborns with critical CHDs are diagnosed prenatally or identified soon after birth by just doing pulse oximetry testing. However, some affected infants are not diagnosed until after discharge from birth hospitalizations. So in infants with critical cardiac lesions, the risk of morbidity and mortality increases when there is a delay in diagnosis and timely referral to a tertiary center with expertise in treating these patients. So how do we do that? How do we screen these patients? We do actually the CCHD screening tool, which is just using the pulse oximetry. So there are 7 main conditions screened. The target conditions are the following: hypoplastic left heart syndrome, pulmonary atresia, TOF, TAPVR, TGA, tricuspid atresia, and truncus arteriosus. So pulse oximetry screen is considered positive if the measured oxygen saturation is less than 90%. So wala nang repeat necessary. So fail na yon. So threshold is saturation of is less than 95% or a difference of more than or equal to 4% saturation between the right hand and the foot, either right or left foot. So less than 95% and more than 4% or 4% or more O2 saturation difference between preductal and postductal. So once you have identified, it is important that you ask for to the echo to see what is the definitive cardiac lesions of this patient for so that timely management, appropriate referral should be done to prevent mortality at this early age. Okay, now we go to patent ductus arteriosus. This is actually the last slide. So what is PDA? What is the normal course? Typically, it closed during the 12 to 15 hours based on Nelson. This is the physiologic closure, meaning wala nang blood flow across the DA, the ductus arteriosus. Anatomic closure depending on the gestational age of the patient. But dapat for term patient in 28 days or during the first month of life, it should close for the premature patients during the first up to 3 months of life. So beyond this is actually considered congenital. So you call this CHD, patent ductus arteriosus. Symptoms for term patients usually asymptomatic. However, you would see depending actually on the size of the lesion. So there could be, if it's large lesion, then you appreciate hemodynamic instability as early as after birth. For preterm patients naman, there would be decreased blood flow to the gut, so causing neck or pulmonary hemorrhage or BPD. So how do we treat these? Fluid restrictions, maintaining a good hematocrit level, actually giving NSAIDs, ibuprofen. Before, the mainstay of treatment is indomethacin, but due to the large renal ang tawag dito effect, mas preferred na ngayon ng ibuprofen as closure as well as paracetamol. If medical closure failed, then we can actually put this patient to surgical correction, either by amplats or by percutaneous closure using a device or surgical closure or ligation. Okay, that's the end of the first part of our lecture. So hopefully the second part would be less tedious as this first part. You have any question, guys? Okay, so thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye. You reserve your question na lang later. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you po, Doc.